June 19, 1944. The sun bled over the horizon at Saipan, its light catching on the jagged ridges of volcanic rock and the smoke still curling from shattered bunkers. The battle had raged for days, the American Marines pressing deeper into the island, the Japanese fighting with the tenacity of men sworn to die before surrender. Bodies lay scattered among the cane fields, the air thick with the acrid stench of cordite and the salt of the Pacific. For the first time, small clusters of Japanese soldiers, bloodied and trembling, stumbled from caves with their hands raised high. They had been told capture meant humiliation, torture, and certain death. Yet the reality waiting for them was something they could not comprehend. American guards guided them past rows of tents, their rifles steady, but their demeanor calm, almost businesslike. The prisoners braced for blows, expecting the cruelty they had been taught to anticipate. Instead, the Marines handed them canteens of cold water, chunks of bread, and, most astonishing of all, a small bottle with a red label, Coca-Cola. To men who had survived on rice balls and stagnant cave water, the sight of a fizzy, sweet American drink was beyond imagination. One prisoner later recalled that he thought it was some strange medicine, a trick perhaps until he tasted it. The sugar exploded on his tongue like fireworks, the bubbles racing down his throat in sharp, sweet shocks. In that moment, the mythology of the barbaric American collapsed, replaced by bewilderment. The scene repeated across the Pacific theater. At Guam, at Peleliu, at Okinawa, weary Japanese soldiers, dragged from tunnels or caught in desperate surrenders, found themselves offered not death, but chocolate bars torn from ration packs. Hershey's, stamped with a logo they could not read but instantly recognized as something alien, decadent. To soldiers raised in a society of scarcity, where sugar was rationed and luxuries virtually non-existent by 1944, the taste of American chocolate was nothing short of miraculous. Many broke down, tears streaking through the grime on their faces, unable to reconcile the sweetness with the horrors they had endured only hours earlier. To the Americans, this act was not charity. It was procedure, habit, even a subtle form of power. Prisoners were fed, guarded, and catalogued because the machinery of war demanded order. Rations were plentiful, supply lines stretched like veins across the Pacific, and a chocolate bar was simply another item in the endless flow of crates and cartons. To the Japanese, however, it was something symbolic, proof of an enemy so wealthy, so industrially mighty, that even its soldiers' snacks were luxuries beyond reach. The battlefield at Saipan provided more than prisoners. It provided revelations. Japanese officers who had preached that Americans were weak, decadent, and incapable of true sacrifice now saw their men drinking American sodas with trembling hands. The shock cut deeper than bullets. If this was the enemy, rich, well-fed, calm even in victory, what hope remained? One captured corporal whispered to his fellow detainees that the United States must have been a nation of gods to create such abundance. The bottle of Coke in his hand seemed to mock the years of starvation he had endured. Even the way the Americans behaved confounded them. Guards offered cigarettes, sometimes even lighting them for their captives. When asked, through broken translators or improvised gestures, why they would share luxuries with the enemy, the Americans shrugged. For them, it was routine. For the Japanese, indoctrinated with tales of cruelty and vengeance, it was unfathomable. One prisoner remembered staring at the chocolate in his palm, certain it was poisoned, until the guard tore off a piece and ate it himself, grinning. Only then did he dare to taste it, and the sweetness shattered him more than any interrogation could. Yet these moments of kindness did not erase the brutality of the war raging outside the wire. Artillery thundered, and kamikaze charges were still tearing apart Marine lines. But inside the prisoner compounds, there was an odd stillness punctuated by the hiss of opened bottles and the crackle of ration wrappers. A paradox unfolded. While American and Japanese soldiers slaughtered each other across ridges and beaches, a few hundred captives sat bewildered, tasting the wealth of an industrial giant they had been told was weak and decaying. For some Japanese soldiers, this was a humiliation worse than defeat. To be fed by the enemy was to admit dependence. Yet for others it was a revelation. They realized for the first time how vast the gulf truly was between the two nations. Japan fought with dwindling rice stocks and homemade substitutes for sugar and salt. America fought with cargo ships filled to the brim with real coffee, cigarettes by the ton, and enough chocolate to hand out to its enemies. It was not just military power on display. It was the empire of abundance. Night fell on Saipan, and the prisoners sat under canvas awnings, listening to the distant gunfire and the low hum of American generators. Some clutched bottles they had emptied hours ago, unable to throw them away, as if the glass itself carried some talismanic power. Others licked the last crumbs of chocolate from their hands, tasting again and again the impossible sweetness. The guards moved through the camp with practiced ease, their silhouettes framed by lantern light, their laughter and easy banter, another reminder that these were not monsters, but men. For the Japanese it was a disorienting theater. Their propaganda had promised death at the hands of a brutal foe. Instead, they found themselves treated with a mixture of indifference and casual generosity. To men who had been ready to die, this was a new kind of torment. To live, and to live at the mercy of an enemy who fed you better than your homeland ever could. In the larger scope of war, a bottle of Coca-Cola and a square of chocolate were trivial things. Yet for those men, in those hours after surrender, they became symbols of a world turned upside down. Symbols of an America whose strength was not only in tanks and planes, but in the very ability to make sweetness flow like water. The prisoners could not believe it, because to believe it was to accept the enormity of their nation's defeat. Stand still as the night deepened and the stars hung over the Pacific. They sipped, they chewed, and they wondered what it meant that the first taste of kindness in years came from the hands of the enemy. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its bloodiest phase. The Japanese Empire, once triumphant across vast swaths of Asia and the Pacific, was now cornered. Its navy crippled, its air force reduced to desperate kamikaze missions, and its armies stranded on islands they could neither defend nor escape. Yet even as the tides of battle shifted, the ideology that drove Japanese soldiers remained fierce. From the jungles of New Guinea to the cliffs of Okinawa, men were told they must fight to the death. Surrender was not simply dishonor, it was betrayal of family, emperor, and nation. The Bushido Code, bent and twisted into military doctrine, demanded self-sacrifice. And so when American forces stormed the beaches of Saipan or Guam, they expected and received ferocious resistance. For the Americans, the Pacific presented more than just geography. It was a theater of extremes. Jungles bred disease, volcanic islands burned with unrelenting heat, and supply lines stretched thousands of miles across an unforgiving ocean. Yet the United States fought with an arsenal unlike any the world had ever seen. Its soldiers carried not only rifles and grenades, but the comforts of an industrial empire that seemed limitless. From K-rations packed with chewing gum and chocolate to crates of Coca-Cola shipped across the Pacific, America fought with abundance. The contrast could not have been sharper. Japanese soldiers on isolated islands subsisted on dwindling rice stores, often supplemented by coconuts, roots, or even insects. Their uniforms rotted in the humidity, their boots wore through, their bodies wasted away. American soldiers, by comparison, rotated fresh rations, maintained medical supply chains, and could summon artillery, airstrikes, or naval bombardments with terrifying efficiency. For the Japanese, every engagement became not only a fight against the enemy, but against starvation, thirst, and exhaustion. This disparity shaped more than tactics. It shaped expectations. American troops were briefed that Japanese soldiers would fight to the last man, that surrender was a rarity. And indeed, most battles confirmed this. At Tarawa, only a handful of Japanese survived from a garrison of thousands. At Peleliu, entire units chose suicide charges over capture. Yet as the war dragged into its later years, something unexpected began to happen. Small groups of prisoners emerged, men too wounded to fight, too starved to resist, or too disillusioned to obey orders of certain death. These rare captures provided the Americans with more than intelligence. They provided human faces to an enemy, often dehumanized in propaganda. For the first time, Marines and soldiers looked into the eyes of frightened, broken young men who had been taught they would be executed if captured. What followed shocked both sides. The Americans, hardened by months of brutal combat, did not butcher them. They processed them, guarded them, and astonishingly shared their rations. The historical context deepens here. By 1944, America's industrial juggernaut had reached full stride. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago. The engines of war production thundered day and night. Tanks rolled off assembly lines, Liberty ships launched weekly, and with them came supplies measured in millions of tons. Within this tide of material were small but powerful symbols, the Coca-Cola bottle and the Hershey bar. The U.S. government, recognizing their value for morale, ensured they accompanied soldiers wherever they went. A Hershey bar wasn't simply food, it was a piece of home, a reminder of comfort in the midst of chaos. Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink. It was a national icon, liquid proof of American industry's reach. The Japanese, meanwhile, were being crushed beneath the weight of blockade and bombardment. By mid-1944, American submarines prowled shipping lanes, strangling Japan's access to raw materials. Factories struggled with shortages of steel, rubber, and oil. Civilians at home lived under strict rationing. Sugar, once a luxury, was almost non-existent. Soldiers were given rice balls or dried fish when supplies allowed, but many units found themselves scavenging to survive. For men raised in this environment of scarcity, the sudden taste of an American chocolate bar was a revelation beyond comprehension. The prisoner camps themselves became stages for this clash of realities. Surrounded by barbed wire, watched over by young Americans with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, the Japanese prisoners waited for the cruelty they expected. Instead, they received calories, sugar, even sweetness. In those small, seemingly insignificant gestures, entire worldviews began to fracture. A corporal from the Imperial Japanese Army, captured on Guam, later recounted that he had been taught Americans were demons who drank blood. When handed a bottle of Coca-Cola, he thought it might be poisoned. But after his first sip, confusion gave way to astonishment. Could demons make something so refreshing, so frivolous, so human? This disconnect between expectation and reality rippled outward. Japanese officers had drilled into their men that the Americans were weak, a soft, luxury-dependent people who could not endure hardship. Yet here in the camps it was clear, the Americans had luxuries not because they were weak, but because they were powerful. They could fight and still have enough to hand out chocolate to their enemies. This, more than battlefield defeats, sowed the first seeds of doubt. American commanders, for their part, understood the utility of humane treatment, not purely out of kindness, but because every prisoner represented intelligence, maps of minefields, codes, troop placements, or even whispers of morale. Treating them with respect increased the chances of cooperation. But it was also cultural. The American soldier, raised in a society of plenty, simply did not view a chocolate bar as precious. Giving one away was a small act, almost casual. For the Japanese recipient, however, it was seismic. Thus, the broader context of 1944 is essential to understand the shock Japanese prisoners felt. They were not merely tasting sugar for the first time in years. They were tasting the industrial triumph of an entire nation. They were witnessing, in the fizz of a soda and the snap of a chocolate bar, the inevitability of defeat. For what enemy could ever be beaten if even their guards had the luxury of sharing candy with those they had conquered? The Pacific Theater was a clash of empires, but it was also a clash of realities. Scarcity against abundance, indoctrination against disillusionment. And in the camps of Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, the truth of that clash played out not in artillery barrages, but in the quiet astonishment of prisoners holding bottles and wrappers, staring at proof of a world they had never imagined. The secret was not in the rifle, nor in the tank, nor even in the vast fleets of carriers that shadowed the Pacific horizon. It was in something smaller, something deceptively ordinary. For the Americans, their hidden advantage against the Japanese was not only industrial might or overwhelming numbers, but the culture of abundance itself, embodied in the little things soldiers carried in their packs. Radios that worked in the rain, canteens that didn't corrode, and, most astonishing of all to their captives, the luxury of sweets and sodas in the middle of a battlefield. To a Japanese soldier, surrender meant stepping into a nightmare. Propaganda had warned them that Americans were savages, who mutilated prisoners, who showed no mercy. Yet the hidden advantage lay in the shock of contradiction. When hands were raised, when rifles were dropped, what came instead was not brutality, but a guard casually offering a cigarette, a Hershey's bar broken in half, or a Coca-Cola passed through the wire. This small act, almost thoughtless to the Americans, struck the prisoners with more force than a bombardment. For men who had grown up in a Japan of scarcity, it was inconceivable that an enemy could hand away something so precious. Sugar in Japan had been rationed even before the war. By 1943, it had virtually vanished from daily life. The average Japanese soldier had not tasted true chocolate in years, if ever. And yet here was an American guard tossing a bar into his lap as if it were nothing. The psychological blow was immense. If America could afford to waste luxuries on the enemy, then how vast must its resources truly be? Even Coca-Cola carried layers of hidden meaning. To the Americans, it was a taste of home, a familiar sweetness that linked a Marine on Saipan to a teenager in Chicago. But to the Japanese, it was alien. A drink that fizzed and burned with bubbles, something no Japanese industry could replicate under wartime shortages. It wasn't just refreshment. It was a symbol of American modernity, of an industrial machine so advanced it could mass-produce happiness in a bottle and ship it halfway across the world. Captured Japanese soldiers later admitted that this baffled them more than American tanks or aircraft. They expected technological superiority in weapons, but to see a culture where even common infantrymen carried chocolate into battle shattered their understanding of war. In their minds, luxuries were reserved for generals, for the elite, for the homeland. Yet here, the lowest-ranked private could hand candy to his enemy without hesitation. American war planners understood this psychological edge, even if they never articulated it in such simple terms. Treating prisoners humanely, feeding them well, and allowing them to taste the products of American abundance was a quiet weapon. It destabilized the indoctrination that had kept Japanese soldiers fanatical. Each bar of chocolate, each fizzy sip, was an assault on the lie that Americans were weak. It showed with undeniable sweetness that America was rich beyond measure, rich enough to fight a global war and still hand out candy at the gates of a prison camp. For the prisoners, the contradiction cut deep. Many wrestled with guilt, with the shame of feeling gratitude toward the enemy. Some refused to touch the offerings at first, convinced they were poisoned, convinced that kindness was a trap, but hunger gnawed at them. Thirst clawed at their throats, and eventually they yielded. The taste of chocolate melted away not only suspicion, but something more profound, the image of the American as a barbarian. The hidden advantage was not only psychological, it was logistical. The U.S. military had mastered the art of supply. The Quartermaster Corps ensured that every division, no matter how far from home, received crates of rations that included not only essentials, but morale boosters. The Hershey Corporation alone produced millions of bars for soldiers, while Coca-Cola established bottling plants that followed the advance of U.S. troops across continents. These were not accidents of culture. They were deliberate strategies. America fought with calories, with sugar, with caffeine as much as with steel and gunpowder. Japanese prisoners could not help but compare. They remembered comrades wasting away on moldy rice, or scavenging roots from the jungle. They recalled the bitter taste of ersatz coffee brewed from roasted soybeans, or the watery miso that barely filled their stomachs. To them, the very existence of a surplus of sweets in the American army was beyond belief. It was not merely a treat, it was proof of a civilization operating on a scale Japan could not match. The hidden advantage extended further still. Kindness broke more than bodies, it broke morale. A Japanese soldier, captured and fed, might return after the war to his village and speak of how the Americans had treated him. Rumors spread, stories circulated. The enemy gives candy, the enemy gives drinks. Slowly, the myth of the monstrous barbarian eroded. Even within the caves and bunkers where diehards prepared for final charges, doubt began to fester. Was death really the only choice if capture could mean not torture, but chocolate? It was in truth a subtle form of psychological warfare. The Americans rarely saw it as such, but the effect was undeniable. For the Japanese command, it was a nightmare. The code of no surrender depended on fear, on the certainty that capture meant horror. The reality, undermined by Coca-Cola and Hershey's, was far more corrosive than any leaflet dropped from the sky. Thus, the hidden advantage was revealed, not just in radios that crackled with clear commands, not just in tanks that rolled off Detroit's assembly lines, but in sweetness itself. A bottle cap hissing open, a wrapper crinkling in the night. These were the quiet weapons that dismantled an empire's illusions, and for the prisoners, sitting in the humid dark of a Pacific camp, the realization grew heavy in their hearts. They had not only lost the war of steel, they had lost the war of abundance. Steel, sugar, and supply chains. The American war machine fused them into a rhythm that reshaped the battlefield. To understand why a bottle of Coca-Cola or a bar of chocolate could strike such awe into the hearts of captured Japanese soldiers, one must examine the engineering and logistics behind these seemingly trivial comforts. They were not accidents. They were the result of a nation mobilized with an intensity the world had never seen before. Take the Hershey bar. Long before Marines handed them to prisoners on Saipan or Guam, the U.S. government had approached Hershey's Chocolate Corporation with a request that bordered on the absurd. Create a chocolate bar that would not melt in the tropical heat, that could fit in a soldier's pocket, and that delivered calories dense enough to sustain a man in combat. The result was the D-ration bar. Hard as a brick, bitter compared to normal chocolate, it contained cocoa powder, sugar, skim milk powder, and oat flour, compressed into a 4-ounce block packing 600 calories. Soldiers sometimes joked it tasted like sweetened soap. Yet to a starving prisoner, it was ambrosia. By 1945, Hershey's had produced over 3 billion such bars for the U.S. military. The scale was staggering. Factories in Pennsylvania operated around the clock, their conveyor belts clattering, their machines stamping out thousands of bars per hour. Each was wrapped in foil, sealed in paper, and stacked into crates destined for ships that fanned across the Pacific. This was America's quiet arsenal. Not only tanks and planes, but the calories to keep men fighting and to remind them with every bite of home. Coca-Cola followed a parallel path. In 1941, when the United States entered the war, Coca-Cola's president, Robert Woodruff, issued a simple but revolutionary order. Every American in uniform should be able to buy a bottle of Coke for 5 cents, anywhere in the world. To achieve this, the company, with government backing, built 64 bottling plants overseas during the war. Portable bottling units were shipped with military convoys, capable of producing 10,000 bottles a day. Engineers designed rugged machinery that could withstand the humidity of jungles and the salt air of the Pacific. Trucks delivered crates of soda alongside ammunition. The Japanese could scarcely comprehend it. Their soldiers drank muddy water from helmets, boiled roots to make weak broths, and sometimes licked condensation from cave walls to survive. In contrast, Americans marched into battle refreshed by a fizzy drink that hissed when the cap popped off. The sheer industrial wizardry required to bottle, carbonate, and distribute soda on a battlefield was invisible to the men receiving it, but to their prisoners, it was sorcery. Even the packaging carried weight. American ration cans were stamped from durable tin, sealed airtight. Cigarettes came in neat cardboard packs, protected by cellophane. Matches struck reliably even in damp air. By comparison, Japanese rations were often bundled in waxed paper or bamboo, vulnerable to rot and insects. A prisoner holding a Hershey's wrapper could feel the smooth foil between his fingers, marveling at a civilization that could afford such precision in something so small. The radios added another layer to this hidden advantage. While chocolate and Coke stunned the senses, it was communication technology that stitched American power together. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie and the SCR-536 handheld radio brought clarity and coordination that the Japanese could not match. Frequency modulation eliminated static, allowing commands to cut through gunfire and jungle noise. These devices weighed pounds, contained hundreds of components, and yet were produced in the tens of thousands. Factories from Illinois to New Jersey churned them out. Their circuits soldered by women who had once worked in department stores and now bent over assembly lines with steady hands. To a Japanese officer, captured and forced to watch Americans chat casually into handsets, the shock was profound. Within his army, orders still traveled by runner or signal flag. Entire units could vanish into jungle fog, cut off for days. For the Americans, a commander could redirect artillery in minutes, call down air support in seconds. The same abundance that delivered chocolate also delivered coordination, turning battles into orchestrated symphonies of steel. Factories in the United States became the beating heart of this system. Detroit's automotive plants, once stamping car parts, now rolled out tanks and radios. Hershey's converted entire production lines to military chocolate. Coca-Cola built bottling machinery that could be disassembled, crated, and shipped overseas. The sheer scale of output dwarfed anything Japan could muster. By 1944, America's gross national product dedicated to war was greater than that of all the Axis powers combined. Every crate of chocolate, every bottle of Coke in a prisoner's hand was a piece of that colossal machine the prisoners noticed. Some stared at the embossed Hershey's lettering, tracing it with trembling fingers, wondering how many machines it took to stamp so perfectly. Others turned empty Coke bottles over and over, marveling at the uniform glass, the curves of its design, the tiny raised words that read "Property of Coca-Cola Bottling Co." These details were not lost on men who came from a nation now stripped of raw materials, where factories struggled to make bullets, let alone luxuries. The technological gulf was not simply industrial, it was cultural. American society had grown up on mass production, on the promise that machines could bring comfort to every home. Japan, by contrast, had been rooted in scarcity and hierarchy, where luxury flowed only to the few. When Japanese prisoners tasted chocolate, they were not just tasting sugar. They were tasting the democratization of abundance, the strange reality that even a farm boy from Kansas could fight a war while chewing gum and sipping soda. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. produced 22 million tons of food for its armed forces. Of this, billions of candy bars, millions of gallons of soft drinks, and billions of cigarettes crossed the seas. Japan could not hope to match such output. Its convoys were sunk, its fields bombed, its harvests diverted to survival. Where America measured production in billions, Japan measured shortages in ounces. The result was more than a difference in calories. It was a difference in morale. An American soldier, cracking open a Coke on the beaches of Iwo Jima, carried not just hydration but a reminder of the nation behind him. A Japanese prisoner, watching this with hollow eyes, understood at last that he was fighting not only against a soldier, but against an industrial civilization that could mass-produce joy. In the camps, as wrappers accumulated and empty bottles clinked together, the truth became undeniable. America's hidden advantage was not a secret weapon in the conventional sense. It was the fusion of engineering, logistics, and culture. A Hershey bar contained sugar and milk, but also the roar of Pennsylvania conveyor belts. A Coca-Cola bottle contained carbonation and syrup, but also the hum of bottling plants in distant cities. Each item was a crystallized fragment of a nation that had mobilized its factories as surely as it had mobilized its armies. And so what began as a trivial kindness, handing a prisoner a piece of chocolate, became something larger. It was industrial might in miniature, technology wrapped in foil, abundance sealed in glass. The Japanese prisoners could not believe it, because belief meant accepting that their nation was not only outgunned and outmanned, but outproduced in ways so deep, so pervasive, that even sweets had become weapons. September 1944, Lorraine, France. The rolling fields near the village of Aricourt shuddered, beneath the weight of armored giants. German panthers advanced through morning mist, their 75mm cannons swiveling like the eyes of predators. To the east, American Sherman tanks lurked behind hedgerows waiting. But this was not just another clash of steel. This was a lesson, one written not only in explosions and fire, but in the subtle ways abundance bent the course of war. The battle began with thunder. German engines roared, tracks grinding soil into churned mud. Their armor was superior, their guns longer, their optics sharper. On paper, they should have swept the battlefield clean. Yet the Americans had something invisible, something that weighed nothing but carried decisive power, communication, coordination, and supply chains that flowed like blood through arteries stretched across the Atlantic. Radios crackled with clear instructions. Artillery units miles away adjusted their fire within seconds. Fighter bombers dove in response to simple calls over handsets. In the midst of this storm, the culture of abundance revealed itself in the smallest moments. American tank crews fought not with fear of starvation, but with rations tucked under their seats, chocolate bars shared in the lull between firefights, canteens filled with water purified by tablets rather than stagnant puddles, cigarettes lit as signals were relayed over radios. These comforts kept men grounded, reminded them they were more than cogs in a machine. And when the German advance faltered under withering crossfire, the disparity was clear. But it was not only in Europe. Thousands of miles away on Saipan, another kind of battle unfolded. There, American Marines faced the full fury of Japanese banzai charges, frenzied assaults of men who had chosen death over surrender. The night sky tore open with screams, tracer fire, and the metallic clash of bayonets. By dawn, hundreds of Japanese lay dead across the fields, their bodies testament to an ethos that refused capture. And yet, among the wreckage, dozens of men staggered out alive, dazed, bleeding, their weapons thrown aside. These were the prisoners who discovered the shocking reality of American abundance. As guards herded them into makeshift enclosures, medics knelt beside them, bandaging wounds, offering canteens of clean water. Then came the moments that etched themselves into memory. A chocolate bar pressed into a trembling hand, a Coca-Cola bottle cracked open and passed to lips parched from weeks of cave air. For these men, conditioned to expect torture, the gesture felt like sorcery. American reports noted the confusion. Prisoners often hesitated, staring at the food suspiciously. Some refused to eat until a guard took the first bite. Others wept silently, unable to reconcile the act of kindness with the hatred they had been taught. Marine guards recorded that prisoners seemed bewildered when given candy, as though trying to understand why an enemy would waste such luxuries on captives. What they could not see was the deeper truth. America's supply chains were so vast, so inexhaustible, that even its prisoners could taste the spoils. The contrast was even more vivid at Okinawa in 1945. As Japanese resistance collapsed, thousands of civilians and soldiers surrendered. American camps swelled with detainees, guarded by young men barely older than the captives themselves. Into these camps flowed food, water, medical supplies, and astonishingly Coca-Cola. Photographs from the period showed Japanese prisoners smiling faintly, bottles in hand. The iconic red label a surreal splash of color amid barbed wire and mud. For them, the war had become something unrecognizable. German after-action reports in Europe echoed similar disbelief. At Arakourt, commanders wrote that American tank units seemed to vanish and reappear across the battlefield, coordinating with uncanny precision. They could not understand how American crews maintained morale under relentless fire. The answer, hidden in plain sight, was a fusion of radios, logistics, and morale-sustaining rations. Men who fought with full bellies and reliable supplies fought longer, harder, and with steadier nerves. The numbers told the same story. At Arakourt, the Germans lost 86 tanks in 2 weeks of fighting. The Americans lost 25. On Saipan, of the 30,000 Japanese defenders, only 921 were taken prisoner. Yet those 921 carried back to Japan, after the war, stories of chocolate and Coca-Cola. Tales of an enemy who fought with overwhelming firepower, yet still had the luxury of sweetness to spare. For the Japanese High Command, this was the greatest insult, that surrender did not mean starvation but abundance. Inside the camps, the psychological war continued. Prisoners who accepted chocolate were ridiculed by their peers, accused of weakness, yet hunger gnawed at pride. One corporal, captured at Peleliu, later admitted he had hidden a candy wrapper in his uniform, carrying it like a relic. It reminded him of the moment he realized Japan could not win. Not against men who fought with radios in one hand and chocolate in the other. American guards often saw these acts as trivial. They were not instructed to use food as propaganda. They were simply following procedure, handing out rations. But the effect was profound. Every bite of chocolate, every sip of Coke was a reminder of the gulf between the two nations. For the prisoner, it was an epiphany. If the Americans could share such abundance in war, how great must their power be in peace? The battles of Arakourt, Saipan, and Okinawa demonstrated that victory was not only won with weapons, it was won with morale, logistics, and the quiet power of plenty. The German tank crews who marveled at American coordination, the Japanese prisoners who tasted sugar for the first time in years, both confronted the same truth. America's hidden advantage was not merely industrial might, but the ability to project that might down to the smallest details of war. And so, on battlefields scattered across continents, the image repeated, men surrendering, hands trembling, then staring in disbelief as the enemy offered them not cruelty, but chocolate and Coca-Cola. A sweetness that mocked their indoctrination, a fizz that drowned the lies they had been told. It was in these moments, more than in any single barrage or charge, that the war's true balance of power was revealed. The war was not only fought with bullets and bombs, it was fought in the hearts and minds of men. When Japanese prisoners sat in American camps, sipping Coca-Cola or unwrapping a Hershey's bar, they were not merely tasting sugar, they were tasting defeat, tasting the scale of America's overwhelming superiority. This psychological impact was as devastating as any bombardment. It reached into their souls, undermining years of indoctrination, leaving them to question the very foundations of the empire they had sworn to serve. For the Japanese soldier, capture was supposed to be worse than death. Officers had drilled into their men the code of Bushido, demanding sacrifice and honor in the face of impossible odds. Families back home were told that any relative who surrendered was no longer truly Japanese, that they were ghosts without honor. Yet here, in American camps, men who had chosen life were not tortured or humiliated. Instead, they were handed food, water, medical care, and most shockingly, luxuries. The shame of survival now mingled with the sweetness of chocolate, a contradiction so sharp it carved at their very identity. Many prisoners described feeling both humiliation and awe. To accept food from the enemy was to acknowledge dependence, a crushing blow to pride. But at the same time, the act revealed the lie at the heart of wartime propaganda. The Americans were not barbarians. They were organized, calm, and so powerful that they could treat even their enemies with casual generosity. This duality gnawed at captured soldiers. It made them wonder, if our empire demands that we starve while the enemy feeds even its captives, who truly holds the moral high ground? On the battlefield, the psychological toll was just as severe. Japanese soldiers still fought with fanatical courage, launching suicidal banzai charges. But whispers began to spread. Tales of men who had been captured and lived. Tales of food, of candy, of strange drinks with bubbles that fizzed like magic. These stories, impossible to suppress, worked like termites gnawing at the pillars of fanaticism. A man preparing to die might, in the back of his mind, wonder if surrender could mean something other than horror. For the Americans, the psychological edge was not only about kindness, it was about unity. Their radios kept platoons connected, their logistics kept bellies full, and their rations carried reminders of home. A soldier chewing gum or sipping Coke on the line felt tethered to the life he had left behind. He was not isolated. He was part of a larger, unstoppable force. The psychological weight of abundance gave him resilience. By contrast, Japanese soldiers fought in isolation, cut off by silence when radios failed, starving when supplies ran dry, left only with the cold comfort of ideology. German observers in Europe noticed the same phenomenon. Reports from the Wehrmacht described American units as elastic, able to absorb losses and recover swiftly. When command tanks were destroyed, American platoons continued to fight with coordination, their radios allowing instant reorganization. In contrast, German and Japanese units often collapsed when leaders fell, their doctrines dependent on rigid hierarchy. The Americans' advantage was not just material, it was psychological flexibility, born of connectivity and abundance. The impact reached beyond the battlefield. In the camps, Japanese prisoners slowly came to terms with their new reality. Some resisted, refusing food, clinging to the pride of defiance. Others succumbed, eating hungrily, their shame soothed by the undeniable sweetness of chocolate. A few even began to talk, offering information in exchange for small comforts. Cigarettes bought maps, chocolate loosened tongues. Coca-Cola, in its own way, became a currency of war. The Americans understood this intuitively, if not strategically. A guard who offered a candy bar was not only showing kindness, he was softening the enemy, breaking down the walls of fear. Intelligence officers noted that prisoners treated humanely were far more likely to cooperate. The gesture of giving a Coca-Cola was as effective as any interrogation technique because it struck directly at the enemy's assumptions. Psychologically, the message was devastating. America had so much power, so much wealth, that it could afford to be generous. For the Japanese, raised in a culture of scarcity, this was incomprehensible. The empire demanded sacrifice down to the last grain of rice. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to fight a war where even prisoners dined better than soldiers in the field. This revelation broke spirits. It convinced many that Japan's struggle was not only doomed, but delusional. Even after the war, the memory lingered. Former prisoners wrote of the moment they first tasted chocolate, describing it as both bliss and despair. Bliss because it awakened forgotten sensations of sweetness, despair because it revealed the futility of fighting against such an enemy. In memoirs and interviews, they admitted that those simple luxuries convinced them America's victory was inevitable. One described it as defeat in the mouth, the realization as chocolate melted on his tongue that his nation could never match such abundance. For American soldiers, the effect was subtler but no less profound. Handing out candy and soda reinforced their sense of superiority. It reminded them they were the liberators, the industrial juggernaut, the bringers of not just destruction but also abundance. This confidence translated into morale, into resilience, into the belief that victory was certain. It was not arrogance but a quiet assurance, reinforced every time a crate of supplies arrived intact. Thus, the psychological impact of chocolate and Coca-Cola was twofold. For the Japanese, it was disorientation, humiliation, and revelation, the shattering of myths. For the Americans, it was reassurance, pride, and unity, the confirmation of strength. Together, these forces shaped the course of the Pacific War in ways that statistics alone could never capture. Wars are often remembered for the clash of armies, the roar of cannons, the thunder of aircraft. But the mind of a soldier can be broken more easily by hunger, by despair, by the bitter taste of scarcity. And it can be reshaped even in captivity by the sweetness of sugar and the fizz of soda. The Japanese prisoners who sat in American camps did not simply lose their weapons. They lost their illusions, and in losing them, they glimpsed the true scale of the enemy they had fought. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world awoke to a new order. Cities lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and the Pacific was littered with the wreckage of ships, planes, and lives. Yet for many Japanese prisoners of war, one memory endured with unusual clarity: the taste of Coca-Cola and chocolate offered by the very men they had been told would slaughter them. That sweetness, unexpected and undeserved, carried lessons that reached far beyond the barbed wire of prison camps. For the Japanese, the war's end was not merely military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. They had believed in the divinity of their emperor, the superiority of their culture, and the weakness of their enemies. But in the camps, the illusions dissolved. The Americans were not barbarians. They were organized, powerful, and above all abundant. The fact that they could fight across the globe and still ship luxuries to their troops, and even to their prisoners, revealed the scale of their industrial empire. To many Japanese, this abundance was more humbling than any bomb. The legacy of chocolate and Coca-Cola extended into the post-war years. American occupation forces brought with them not only authority, but culture. Children in devastated Japanese cities lined up for candy from GIs, their first taste of sweetness after years of hunger. Coca-Cola bottling plants opened in Japan by 1957, transforming what had once been an alien drink into a national obsession. Hershey's too became a symbol of America's generosity, a reminder that even in war the enemy had shared. These products, once tokens of defeat, evolved into bridges of connection in a rebuilding nation. Strategically, the lesson was unmistakable. War was no longer won by the sharpest sword or the thickest armor. It was won by the ability to feed, to supply, to sustain. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel of Germany reportedly admitted after the war, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same could be said of rations and morale. Japan's soldiers starved in caves, while America's prisoners sipped soda. That disparity was not incidental. It was the product of a nation that had made abundance a weapon. The Cold War only magnified this lesson. As the United States confronted the Soviet Union, it recognized the value of culture and consumer goods as instruments of influence. Coca-Cola became a global symbol, appearing in Berlin, Seoul, and Saigon. Chocolate, music, jeans. These became part of what strategists later called soft power. It was not only about tanks on borders, but about the message embedded in abundance, that American life promised comfort, pleasure, and modernity. The psychological warfare that had begun in prisoner camps now stretched across continents. For veterans, the memory was bittersweet. American soldiers recalled handing chocolate to children in Europe and Japan, cigarettes to weary prisoners, bottles of Coke cracked open in the dust of foreign lands. For them it was a reminder of home, a taste of normalcy in a world gone mad. For Japanese veterans, it became a haunting symbol. In memoirs, many wrote that they realized the war was lost, not when bombs fell, but when they tasted chocolate from the hand of an American guard. That taste became a marker of futility, a reminder that their nation had waged war against an opponent whose wealth was beyond comprehension. The larger legacy shaped modern warfare. From Vietnam to Iraq, from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf, American forces carried not only weapons, but rations infused with the lessons of World War II. The meals ready to eat, the bottled sodas, the candy bars packed into field kits, all carried the same message. Abundance follows the American soldier. And in every theater, enemies who captured such supplies learned again the truth that Japanese prisoners had discovered in 1944. America fought with more than firepower. It fought with comfort, morale, and the ability to sustain its men endlessly. Yet perhaps the deepest lesson was human. In the midst of a war that consumed millions of lives, the act of sharing food with an enemy revealed something enduring. It showed that beneath uniforms and flags, there remained a recognition of shared humanity. To a starving prisoner, a Hershey's bar was more than calories. It was a reprieve from despair, a signal that even in war, compassion could flicker through the cracks of violence. For some, it was the first step toward reconciliation, the first reminder that survival, not death, was a worthy choice. The final irony is that what began as a symbol of American industrial might become in Japan a symbol of recovery. The nation that once trembled before the fizz of Coca-Cola embraced it as its own. The country that once saw chocolate as proof of humiliation now celebrated it as a simple joy. The sweetness that once mocked their defeat later nourished their rebirth. In the grand ledger of history, the guns and bombs weigh heavily. But sometimes it is the smallest gestures that endure longest. A bottle passed through barbed wire. A wrapper torn open under a Pacific sky. A prisoner's disbelief giving way to tears as sugar melted on his tongue. These moments captured the essence of America's hidden strength, not only the ability to destroy, but the power to share. And so the story of Japanese prisoners tasting Coca-Cola and chocolate is more than an anecdote of war. It is a parable of abundance, a testament to the truth that in modern conflict, connection outweighs isolation and morale outweighs fear. Weapons win battles, supply chains win wars, but it is the human act, the handing of sweetness to the defeated, that shapes memory, legacy, and the lessons carried into the future. In the end, the war revealed a universal truth. In the clash between scarcity and abundance, it is abundance that conquers, and in that conquest lies a lesson as relevant today as it was in 1945. Strength is not only measured in tanks and planes, but in the ability to make even enemies taste kindness, a sweetness that lingers longer than the smoke of battle.